Julie Dawson is an assistant professor in the Department of Horticulture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a state extension specialist for urban and regional food systems. Julie's background is in organic plant breeding and participatory research. Julie is currently working with urban and peri-urban farms, providing research and extension support for small-scale farmers and food enterprises, and community gardens focused on food security. So Julie's research topics include season extension methods, organic and participatory variety trials, and variety selection for small acreage farms and gardens. She leads a project with other plant breeders to test varieties with local farmers and chefs focused on flavor for local food systems. So this is Julie's first webinar with us. Welcome, Julie. We're super glad to have you here. And this is the first slide of your presentation.
Great, thanks. Thanks, everybody, for listening in. I'm going to go through a few of the considerations when dealing with intellectual property rights in the context of participatory research, and then give a few examples, one that I've been involved in and then a few others that I've seen of kind of innovative or out-of-the-box ways of dealing with intellectual property rights in a collaborative breeding context. So first, I just wanted to start out with what the role of intellectual property rights are, what people are hoping to accomplish by having intellectual property rights. I think often we see them as a restriction, which is usually the case when we're dealing with some of the larger crops. But they are also sometimes useful, especially if you're trying to protect work that you've spent a lot of time and investment in from a larger company or somebody else potentially taking it. So this is the text of the U.S. Law that established plant variety protection in 1970. And in general, intellectual property rights are trying to protect the work of the plant breeder and also to protect the farmer from fraud of somebody selling a variety that's not actually what it is intended to be. And so you have to define the variety when you register it. The other correlated piece of this is that through intellectual property rights, often companies and plant breeders generate new funding for continued plant breeding. This is through royalties or licenses. And so those three functions are not necessarily something we need to have intellectual property rights as part of UPOF or Canadian or U.S. law, but these functions are something we need to think about when doing participatory research because it's important to protect the collective effort in plant breeding, and it's also important to be able to continue doing the work which requires funding. So in general, there are three main kinds of intellectual property protection that we see in the U.S., and they're similar in Canada, although one of the fastest growing types of protection in the U.S. is patents on varieties themselves, not on gene sequences, but on the varieties, and that does not exist in Canada to my knowledge right now. So that's a big difference between the U.S. and Canada. Plant variety protection allows the variety to continue to be used for breeding and also allows farmers to save the seed of the variety. And it is interesting that that terminology has changed from a farmer's right to a farmer's privilege. And I think we need to continue pushing back against that and not accept it as something that's now been defined as a privilege. The other piece of it is whether other people, not the breeders, can sell seed of that variety. And in a plant variety protection certificate or the equivalent in Canada, the breeder can restrict other people from selling seed of that variety as that variety. And that's one way that they can generate royalties, is if you want to sell this variety, you pay a royalty back to my program. Other forms of intellectual property rights may establish that this variety is developed by this group. It's now in the public domain. Nobody else can patent it, but it's free to be sold or to be developed. And that's what OSSI is trying to do, and Jack will talk a lot more about that, to protect it as a shared commons, but not to restrict people's ability to use it. So in working with collectively bred varieties, I think there are a few different things that go into the decision of whether intellectual property rights are needed or desirable. First is what type of plants are you dealing with. So for a plant that is self-pollinated, it's very easy for other people to save seed. It would be easy for somebody to save seed and sell it, so perhaps you need to protect it if you don't want people outside the group selling seed. A hybrid variety is harder for people to save seed off of and get the same type, although you can start a breeding project with a hybrid variety, and that's often a fun way to start a breeding project. A cross-pollinated, open-pollinated variety might be harder for people to maintain. It might be something where you want some more control over that variety because you don't want it to drift too far from the original description. Do you need to protect it? It may depend on whether you feel like it's at risk of being taken by somebody that you know, perhaps another seed company that might want to commercialize it, whether the people that you're targeting, whether your community of farmers is really bound by an ethical principle that they won't steal it. That's what we've seen in the organic community a lot in the U.S., and so maybe protection like a PVP certificate is not needed because there's that group ethic of people supporting breeding and farmers that are doing breeding work. And then do you need royalties? And this can be separated from whether you want to protect your variety with a PVP certificate or not. There is, I'll talk about a little bit at the end, there are examples of people releasing varieties under an OSSI license and getting royalties, even though there's no legal requirement that somebody pay them royalties. But other places, if you're maybe selling into bigger markets, you might need some form of intellectual property protection if you want to generate royalties to fund a collective effort in plant breeding. The projects that I've been involved in have not sought intellectual property protection. It's been more of a group effort to maintain the varieties, and the ethic is one of sharing rather than one of having ownership over a variety. But I can see contexts where that might be a different decision made by the group. A big question in deciding whether to have intellectual property rights with collective varieties is whether the benefits can actually be shared fairly among all the people that are doing the work. And sometimes that's difficult with people either working for universities or working for a company. That company or that university may actually be the one that owns whatever the breeder does. And the other thing is there may be too many people to necessarily share royalties from a variety that has PVP or other form of intellectual property, and so you may want to look at other methods of protecting it that would allow everybody to benefit. The production of the seed, if it's not each farmer producing their own seed, is also a substantial investment, and so that deserves a return as well. It's something that's often a specialized set of skills. It's not necessarily something every farmer wants to do, although often the easiest way to use participatory varieties bred in participatory programs is for each farmer to produce their own seed. That gets around the need to license things to a seed company or to have a centralized seed production facility. And then finally, who is responsible for really making sure that variety stays true to type over time, maintaining the quality of the variety, or if it's an evolutionary population, defining when it's no longer that variety name and when it's actually become a different variety for whichever farmer is breeding it. So those are all some of the things that go into what kind of ownership is appropriate for a variety that's been bred by a lot of different people rather than by a single person. And often the funding is maybe easiest from a legal standpoint, but hardest from a practical standpoint, because there often is not enough funding generated through licensing fees to actually support a breeding program. And so it becomes dependent on grant funding or on people's donation of time and effort. So I wanted to give a few examples. I was involved in the first one, the Ressources Paysannes in France from 2008 to 2011, and it's still going on. It's a group of farmers there that's breeding wheat for better performance in organic systems and better artisanal bread making quality. And then a few other examples that are really looking at the intellectual property right and funding issues from different perspectives. So the Results Paysan is a group of farmers that has different work groups. So there's a wheat work group and a vegetable work group, a fruit and grape work group. I worked primarily with the wheat group, and we were looking at variety trials and selection on farm for wheat that was adapted to different parts of France. We were mostly working with heritage varieties that then we crossed, and the farmers made selections on their farms from those populations. And the way they've managed the distribution of these varieties is that really you have to be part of an active member of the group, participating in selection and seed multiplication, and trusted by the other members of the group before you're able to get seed of some of these better varieties. And so it's really a group ethic that keeps the varieties in the group, and also they've worked on describing varieties so that they'll be protected from somebody else coming in and trying to take ownership of them, as well as they've worked on methods of collective seed multiplication so that every farmer doesn't have to produce every variety in order for it to be viable. The main thing is that they do not want to assign intellectual property to any of these varieties. They feel like it's a collective effort, and the seed is something that was passed down to them from farmers from 10,000 years ago. And so it's not appropriate for them to claim ownership of it, but it is appropriate to make sure that the seed and the varieties are used in the agricultural systems that they have been developed for. So their website is on that slide if you want to look for more information. Most of it's in French. There are a few English things, but for a Canadian audience, the French may not be an issue. The Biaugerme Seed Cooperative is also in France. This one is one that is not necessarily developing new varieties, but it's improving heirlooms, and it's doing a lot of seed multiplication for hard-to-find varieties. It's based in southwest France, and its members each contribute a certain number of hours or a certain number of units of time to the cooperative every year. So the crops are assigned a certain number of points based on how hard they are to produce. And then you also participate in seed cleaning and distribution and administrative tasks. And it's really been a very vibrant cooperative model of a seed company that's allowed people to do work with the varieties that I think wouldn't necessarily be possible if they weren't also selling seeds that support those efforts. And similarly, in the States, we have some smaller seed companies that are run by farmer breeders, and the seed sales support the breeding efforts, even though they're not claiming any intellectual property rights over those varieties. So Wild Garden Seed is a good example in Oregon, also Adaptive Seed, Hudson Valley Seed Library. We're seeing more and more of these small companies that are doing breeding, but doing breeding funded through seed sales of varieties that they're not necessarily claiming ownership over. This one is interesting because it's kind of a trend that came from the conventional breeding world. Apples are marketed more and more in a club model where you have to be part of the club to get seedlings or scions. In response to this, there's an association in the Midwest called the Midwest Apple Association that's a group of farmers that form an association. Anybody can join as long as they agree to the principles of the association, and they're doing apple breeding work as a collective so that they have access to some improved varieties without necessarily being part of one of the clubs from a bigger apple breeding company. And the farmers in New York went to Cornell because their tax dollars support some of the breeding work at Cornell. And they formed an apple club that includes all of the growers in New York State that then licenses varieties that come out of the Cornell apple breeding program. So that was a way of making a non-exclusive club that had access to these varieties that funds the breeding work, but does so in a way that's not preventing people from participating in the breeding. This example is from Switzerland. It's a small grainage breeder. It's evolved over time. It's a very interesting example of an independent breeder working in collaboration with an association of farmers and consumers in order to fund the development of small grains varieties for organic agriculture in Switzerland. It originally was an association that had about 1,000 members that was funding the breeding even before varieties were developed, were ready for release. The license fees from those varieties don't really cover the breeding costs, so then they worked out some different ways of different funding mechanisms that weren't based solely on seed sales. So one of those was actually an end use or an endpoint royalty where farmers would pay based on harvest rather than based on seed sales. And Peter Kuntz, who's the breeder here, feels like that way the breeder shares in some of the risk of the farmer. Can you still hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay. So my computer just told me the internet connection was lost, so I can't see the screen anymore, but I'm pretty sure I know what the next slides are, but you might have to advance them.
Oh, sure thing. Okay, so we'll advance.
Okay. So I'm still on Sativa. So the other thing they were looking for was the consumer to support some of the breeding efforts. So they've worked with retail stores selling bread in order to recover a certain amount per loaf sold. And the retail stores actually put that on as a selling point, that this loaf has 10 cents that goes to the breeder so that varieties can be developed for Swiss organic farmers. And that actually has increased sales. And so they're funding it partly through consumer support and consumer education about the importance of breeding. So the last slide is on the OSSI model, which Jack is going to talk about, so I'm not going to spend much time explaining the model. But it's a form of intellectual property protection that's based primarily on a moral obligation to not restrict others' freedom to use a variety. But that doesn't necessarily exclude payment of royalties for a variety. So some seed companies like High Mowing have a list of OSSI varieties that are released through OSSI that people can save seed of or do whatever they want with in terms of breeding. And then High Mowing pays royalties back to the breeders because they want to support continued work. They're not necessarily obligated. The breeder doesn't have a legal, they don't have a legal requirement to have a license and pay royalties, but they've done that because they feel like it's important to support the breeding. So I think that wraps up the examples I have. I'm happy to talk about any of these. I can't see the question box anymore, so it'll have to be, I guess, just you, Stephanie, reading off questions. But also, if you want to share my email address, I'm happy to answer questions afterwards by email as well.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was an awesome presentation. We do have a question that came in from Robin. Robin asks, if a collective chooses not to pursue intellectual property rights for their varieties, are they protected from other individuals or companies taking those varieties and commercializing them? And I think you might have alluded to this. Could you offer us a little bit of a clarification on that?
Sure. So the ability to protect a variety depends on it being novel, unique, or distinguishable from other varieties. And stable, meaning it doesn't change over time. So in terms of being novel and distinctive, somebody couldn't take a variety that was already in commerce and then retroactively try to claim it as their own. So if people distributing seed under an OSSI license or under a different form without any IP take the time to describe that and publish that somewhere, that sets a record of prior art that could be used to challenge anyone else taking that variety. I don't know how complicated it would be to defend that because I don't know that there have been that many cases. But in theory, that establishes that that variety has already been developed, has already been used, and so is not new if somebody goes to take out a patent or a PPP on it. I think it would be pretty important to establish who's growing it and show that it has existed since you started it with it in the breeding program. And like I said, I'm not sure how expensive or how complicated it would get to defend it in court.
Cool. Yeah, that makes good sense. A couple of pre-submitted questions came in from people who registered. I think one of them you've addressed really well was just how do you reconcile payment of royalties with farmers, right to save seed, and you've given us some really awesome examples of how groups are working to reconcile that. I wonder what in your opinion or in your experience, what model has worked best for compensating breeding work in that context?
Yeah, I think so. If you look at some of the breeders that are independent farmer breeders or working in a small group and selling seed, what works is always having the next new thing that people want to grow. And so people come back because you produce high quality seed, because it's easier than saving their own seed, and because you have really interesting stuff for them to get the next year or in 2 years. Other models are things where farmers all produce their own seed but contribute time to a collective effort on breeding. So the farmers in France, they're all contributing time to the breeding effort, as well as time to find equipment that can be shared. There's a lot of activity that goes on that supports the breeding efforts, but then they're all producing and saving their own seed, so nobody's dependent on the royalties to do the breeding work. I don't think we figured out how to do it in a more formalized seed market where maybe there's a breeder that's licensing varieties to different seed companies, or there's a group of farmers that is producing varieties that then they want to license to seed companies, because I don't know that people understand quite how much it costs to do some of the breeding, and that it's very hard to fund that based on only royalties. So it may be farmers can save seed, but then if they want to support the breeding program, they could make a donation or have some kind of checkoff when they buy the seed that says, I want to support a royalty to the breeding program, even though I'm going to save my seed, and so I won't be purchasing more seed. Those are models that don't exist yet, and I think that's something we need to really consider going forward. If organic and participatory breeding are to grow, we need to be able to support them financially. The farmers that are doing the work, they are also farming, so they need to be able to find the time to do the breeding work, and maybe that's making it economically profitable enough that they can make money off of the breeding as well as off of their farm sales. I think that's something that we've been talking a lot about in the U.S. and probably you've been talking about in Canada as well, because right now there's not a good model of shared seed and funding of independent breeders, because when there wasn't any ownership on seed before, people primarily saved their own seed and everybody was a plant breeder.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answers it any better. It really, there's not a good answer at this point.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks very much, Julie.